Welcome to the program today. My name is Mondo Gonzales, and I'm here with a prophecy update with Dr. Tommy Ice. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. We want to take advantage of this opportunity. He's been studio filming some other things, and one of the things that I would like to bring up in this prophecy update is really the idea of prophecy at all. There are so many. I have a lot of friends and family and other things that really kind of discount prophecy, especially as we think about the end time events. We think about, I know here at Prophecy Watchers, and I know you are, we're waiting for the rapture, this pre-tribulation rapture where Jesus will come and rescue his church out of the world. Doesn't mean we'll never have trouble. That's not what it's not escapism. But there are those that really are they love Jesus. They have a different theological perspective than us. But there's this rumor that I would love to talk about because you know about it, you've written about it for decades. And it's this idea that the idea of a Pretrib rapture is a recent phenomenon or theological understanding in history. For our audience and for those, if you hear this, I just encourage you to listen to this and to share because we want to get to the nitty-gritty of this and whether this rumor is true, because it's easier for people to just dismiss pre-tribulation theology. Why are you guys looking? You guys are newspaper exegetes, and we want to address that. So kind of give us the history of Darby and everything.
Well, if you go back, you really got to start with the Reformation, because for 1,200 years, the Catholic Church basically didn't allow premillennialism to be talked about, even though it was the clear view for the first roughly 300 years of the early church. And anti-pretribulationalism began in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 2nd century because the Athens people had moved from Athens to Alexandria, Egypt, and it became the center of Greek thought by the 200 BC time. And so everywhere else out in the church, in the early church, other than Alexandria, you had literal interpretation was the norm, and they were all premillennial. Whenever they talked about it, they were always that way. And we're increasingly finding even some guys from back then that were pre-trib.
Yeah, don't want to move too fast here for those that might be watching. When we talk about premillennial, what's that mean?
Well, premillennialism is people that believe that Revelation 19 is when Jesus comes back, and he comes all the way down to planet Earth. Just like he prophesied in Acts 1, he'll return in the same way as he left. And then the 1,000-year reign of Christ, where he reigns and rules from Jerusalem, occurs.
A physical, literal, real
And that's
kingdom.
called the Millennium, or the 1,000 years. That's the Latin. It's chiliasm, if you go with the Greek, is another term for it. And there has developed in history really amillennialism, which you had before that. You had anti-millennialism. You had people like those in Alexandria, Egypt, who were simply opposed to premillennialism because of their philosophy of, the millennium couldn't be a carnal thing that involved the flesh.
Kind of a Gnostic.
Exactly. And so that then became an official view with people like Augustine in the early 400s, where they taught something called amillennialism, which they taught that, and this is after 313, where Constantine Christianized the Roman Empire, you see. And so they taught that the current age is the millennium. That's historic amillennialism, that we're in the millennium now. And I always like to say, if this is the millennium, then I must be in the ghetto side, but there is no ghetto in the millennium, And the fact of the matter is, then you had even early on some people that were more optimistic, and that eventually, especially by the time of the Reformation, morphed into what we call post-millennialism. So post-millennialism is pretty much the idea of, it's very similar in many ways to amillennialism, but it says that God is going to eventually convert all the people before he returns.
Through the church.
Through the church and through the preaching of the gospel. And so both amillennialism and postmillennialism have no future for Israel.
Let's stop for a minute on that because, let's bring our emotions in, which is always dangerous. But the idea of a postmillennial theology where the church wins the world for Jesus, man, that sounds great. But what I want and what I think and my emotions of how it make me feel is not how we determine theology.
Well, yeah, and I was the co-author of a book in 1988 called Dominion Theology, Blessing or Curse, an analysis of the Christian Reconstruction movement. And, I pointed out in that book that there's not a single passage that teaches post-millennialism or even amillennialism. Those are things that are derived based on secondary reasoning. Mm-hmm. Whereas we, as premillennialists, can go and say, well, Revelation 19 happens where Jesus returns, and you see this sequence of 7 and I saws, which are one thing after another. It's chronological, I believe. And then you have the millennium in chapter 20 being talked about 6 times. And so that is why the early church was premillennialist, because Christ returns and then you have the millennium. Whereas there's no passage that lays out either amillennialism or postmillennialism. And so they have to use all kinds of, in my opinion, invalid reasoning and philosophical thought and all of this kind of stuff to try to make their case.
When you come to the 16th century and Martin Luther and the Reformers, they embrace the gospel, in some sense was lost, certainly during the Middle Ages. Right. Within Catholic theology. They re-embrace the gospel, which when you read the scripture, the gospels, they're embracing it in a very straightforward, literal way, and understanding the nature of, salvation and substitution and a variety of things. And I mean, they had their work cut out for them.
Right.
And so a lot of people will say, yeah, they rescued the gospel from really the Dark Ages, and they never really got around potentially to really in the eschatology, the study of last things. Do you see that in history?
Yes, exactly. They were dealing, they were running for their life, among other things, and it would be interesting to see what Luther and Calvin would have believed had they been exposed in a better atmosphere to premillennialism, because in the 1500s, some of the cults were chiliastic or millennial. Mm-hmm. And they were basically forerunners of modern communism and socialism, you see. And so they were reacting to a lot of that. And it wasn't until the late 1500s, early 1600s, that you began what's called the Post-Reformation Era, that you have people becoming by the carload premillennial, because they're starting to apply the literal hermeneutic, which Calvin and Luther both stated theoretically a correct hermeneutic, but of course they didn't follow it consistently.
And their soteriology, really, certainly, people talk about Calvinism, and I don't want to get into that whole thing, but just in the sense of, people say, well, it's Augustinianism. So a lot of the influence, I'll say it that way, of Augustine as it relates to salvation, certainly permeated all the way through into the Middle Ages, into the Reformation. And so, you have this giant of St. Augustine having this amillennial view. And, I don't know, they agreed with him here on the salvation issue, but they did not want to disagree with him? Give us some background on that.
I think it's because they were dealing with the whole issue of what is the gospel primarily. Mm-hmm. And they just were not dealing with chiliasm or premillennialism that much. Now, Calvin talks about it and everything, but as famously known, Calvin wrote a commentary on every book but the book of Revelation, Yeah. And he was very anti-chiliast. And some people argue over whether he had post-millennial leanings or they're just amillennial, but he wasn't favorable toward premillennialism. But interestingly enough, it was the Calvin and his disciples that came along who became the champions of premillennialism. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because as things develop, you get soteriology and the doctrine of salvation and sanctification. In fact, that's one of the arguments that a guy named J. Edwin Orr made in the late 1800s is the progress of dogma. And look at church history, and you see the development of the doctrine of God, Scripture first, then the doctrine of God, the Trinity, and all of this, then the doctrine of who Christ is. That's taking place in the People thought that the leading view of the atonement up until 1100 was that Christ paid off Satan. It's called the ransom to Satan theory.
Yeah.
And that's heresy. Mm-hmm. So you have, and the same with justification by faith. It's believed that Luther was the first to articulate that in a clear way. And so we call that the progressive dogma. And the last two areas historically to be developed. Now, they had views in the early church of all these things, but we're talking about systematic outworking and dealing with theological development and what all that means in a sophisticated way were ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, and eschatology, and they go hand in hand. And everybody, even through the 1800s, talked about the church as the new Israel and stuff like that. And so as the 1800s developed, you begin to have more technical and accurate, especially in the New Testament, exegesis develop. And so you begin to have this slow move toward a refined, more accurate, inductive exegesis of Scripture, which then gave rise to, we believe, premillennialism. But before that, you had the rise of premillennialism among the Puritans.
So hold that thought for a minute, because here's why. There's so much evidence in the Puritans, which I want to discuss. Let's set the stage for the accusation of Darbyism beginning in the 1820s, and then let's circle back to how it's inaccurate. So give us the accusation that many people make against pre-tribbers.
Well, Darby, of course, he was born and raised in London, but he was from a very wealthy family of Irish people. So when he was 16, he goes off to college there in Dublin. And that, by the way, was the elite school, even more than Oxford and Cambridge were. They produced like twice the scholars back in the 1800s. Back then, everybody took the same courses. And there were no theology or Bible courses in any of their training. But they had to go on Saturdays and listen to lectures on theology. And they had theology professors and things like that, but they really didn't take any classes on that. Everything was focused on languages. And so Darby becomes this Greek scholar and Hebrew scholar. And he received a gold medal. And it's not like every year they had the best student or something like that, but it's every so often, it could be 10 years between the giving of those awards. He received the gold medal for languages. And so he was a brilliant linguist guy. And then his father wanted him to become a lawyer. So he then goes to what basically was law school for the next 3 years. And the day he graduated, he felt the call to go into the pastorate. And his father was so upset he disinherited him. And he goes off and he becomes a Church of England pastor or clergyman. And he goes to the poorest area in Ireland. And at one point, he was leading, they say, 500 to 600 people a week to Christ. Wow. In other words, they were converting from Catholicism to Protestantism. And many of the Irish thought the Reformation was finally coming to Ireland. And then the bishop, his Anglican bishop, said they had to become official members of the Church of England or something like, and that killed, nobody would talk to him after that. And that killed his evangelism. And so he comes back to Dublin and he has a riding incident that his leg was hurt in 1827. And by the way, Darby's dates are 1800 to 1882. They're easy to remember. And so he then goes to one of his sisters whose husband, Penfeather or Pen something, becomes the head of the Supreme Court of Ireland and all this. Those are the kind of people he was around. Regular people didn't go to college back then, only the elite, so they were all that way. And so he's recouping for about 3 months, and he reads nothing but his Greek and Hebrew text, and he begins to see the pre-trib rapture. He begins to see that the church is a distinct age from Israel, because everybody else just sees this endless continuity because everything's based on the doctrine of salvation, you see. And so the Old Testament, I used to use the phrase the Old Testament church.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
And the New Testament church, you see. And so he begins to understand the pre-trib rapture during that convalescence in 1827. Okay, then later, months later, you had the Margaret MacDonald incident and all these other things. And so he goes, by the way, Darby went to Oxford and had a famous lecture series there. And a lot of people started, following him or whatever, but then he goes and starts meeting with the brethren who already were started. And the brethren were groups of people that were fed up with the liturgy and all of this. And one of the things that they did was having the communion every Sunday, every Lord's Day and all of this. And you begin to have a lot of these elite people over time, up to the 1850s and beyond, becoming brethren. And there's all kinds of famous people that became brethren. And Darby kind of became the leader of them. And he translated the Bible, the whole Bible, into 3 different languages, including English. I have a copy of the Darby. The New American Standard is a revision, or the American Standard is a revision of the Darby translation, and the New American Standard is a revision of the American Standard. So in a sense, the baseline translation was the Darby translation. That's my #1 Bible, is the New American Standard. And he did the New Testament in 6 different languages. And he would go somewhere, for example, to Europe, and he would learn the language there. And for example, I remember having a debate one time with Ken Gentry on preterism. And at the end of the debate, I asked him, have you ever won a gold medal from the elders of Geneva for having saved the Reformed faith? And he said, what? And I said, well, Darby did in 1839. And he went there for 2 years. One of his brothers, who was a businessman, invited him there, and they were moving away from orthodoxy. And he goes there and champions and returns the whole clergy in Geneva back to the Reformed faith. And he received a gold medal from the elders of Geneva, Switzerland, for having saved the Reformed faith, which is obviously comes from Calvin and those other people like that. And so, he's an amazing guy. He's one of the 5 most voluminous writers in the history of the church.
For those that are watching this, oftentimes he's just, caricatured as being some crazy crackpot, from London with a cult. And in reality, the things that you're describing clearly refute, those really, I would say, superficial criticisms, for sure.
He loved poor people and children, but he was unrelenting if you got in a doctrinal issue with him.
Man of conviction.
That is most of the British were that way back then. People forget that in our American culture, So that's one of the things I bring up about him. He was so dogmatic and everything. Well, yeah, he was dogmatic.
Which, there's, especially when it comes to certain things.
Right.
So, giving us a history of the character, really, and the nature, again, we don't worship Darby as we wouldn't worship anybody, Luther or Calvin or any of the rest of them. But the accusation is that this, and I'd like to go back, the accusation is that he started this pre-trib idea. It would never exist in the history of the church up until this time. And we carry, you're very familiar with this book, we carry this book, Dispensationalism, before Darby. You knew William Watson. And he kind of described what he did and also your work and what you guys have worked on in the sense of refuting, really, a very easily refutable theory.
This whole idea that the pre-trib rapture is new, and I think our movement is a Bible movement. Its whole emphasis is on teaching the Bible. And everybody admits that about dispensationalists. They are biblically oriented people. Now, obviously, many people disagree with us, but they all admit we love the Bible, we teach the Bible, we study the Bible. And I think it took, for example, in the 1950s, within our movement, there were hardly any guys that had PhDs, that had studied church history. And there were some, but not many. And I think it just took a while for the movement to mature enough to where we started studying, had guys in our movement that start studying in-depth church history that wasn't in those three sets of church history in English, you see what I'm saying? And that's what's happening. And so they're going back, and other people from other perspectives weren't interested in finding pre-tribulational rapture people. And so now, especially because of that challenge, you've had trained people like Bill Watson, a PhD from University of California, and he was a specialist in the 1600s and 1700s, European history.
Yeah, English literature, history,
yes,
theology. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And he had a seminary degree from Talbot Seminary. And he had a debate on his campus at Colorado Christian with somebody on this issue like 12 years ago, and that got him interested into all of this, and he spent his summers going over to England and tracking all this stuff down. And then comes the internet where you can do that at home now. You can study, do researches and all this kind of stuff.
And we don't have all the information, and as the technology is allowing us, more research is being done. You can put in search terms in the Greek and the Old Latin and all of it. So this is a minimum, which is really just scratching the surface of providing a body of evidence showing that the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture, a 7-year tribulation, is not new.
Right. And that answers probably the number one criticism of pre-tribulationalism. That, well, if pre-tribulationism is taught in the Bible, how come nobody saw it before Darby?
Yeah, nobody talked about it.
That is basically the argument. Well, we're finding out there were a lot of people. But you had 1,200 years when the Roman Catholic Church banned premillennialism. And so it begins to die off by the 400s, you see. So if you're not premillennial, you're not going to be pre-trib, you see. Yeah. Pre-tribulationalism is a sub-development within premillennialism.
As you watch this, you think, how is this a prophecy update? Well, let me tell you why. Because when we think about prophecy updates, we're looking around, we're watching the current events, we're watching the way that the world is shifting, and we're looking at it through really a biblical lens and a theological lens. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do was to show, especially since Tommy was here, was this accusation comes out, and ultimately the accusation is meant to tell us that when we look out at the world and we're trying to understand the current prophetic events, it's a waste of time. And so we want to say, no, it is not a waste of time. Not only is it biblical, but what we're shown today, and we just barely were able to get to the glimpse of it, was that it's historical and it's theologically accurate. And so when people come and try to dissuade you from exploring these things, and they're throwing these accusations, you say, well, hey, have you not heard or have you not read truly? So, let's close it out here. But if you have any, really follow-up comments to that, what do you say to the audience of those that are really getting torn between friends and family and the confusion?
Well, what really developed in the early 1800s was the realization that Israel meant Israel. Mm-hmm. And even in the 1600s and 1700s, those who were premillennial, they still saw that as a phase of the church. You see what I'm saying? So once Israel began to be seen as Israel, you have the rise of dispensationalism, you see, which sees as one of Ryrie's sine qua nons, it's a distinction between God's plan for Israel and the church. And so that really hasn't been developed fully until the early 1800s as they begin to develop it. And now it's fully developed. You see, I just don't see any further development really going because unless there's a paradigm shift and you go in a different direction.
Yeah. I suppose if Israel was nuked and was gone and they were scattered and they never existed, that would be really interesting. I think it would be like, wow, but we're not dealing with hypotheticals.
No.
We're dealing with facts.
And God says it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
God has all of these focuses on Israel and the fact that they have their 70th week left. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's bringing them back into the land. Now, You know, I graduated from high school in 1969, and I thought, you know, I got married in December 1972, and I was like, oh, I hope the rapture doesn't come before we get married, and those kinds of things. I'm sure many of the viewers have experienced similar things. Well, it's been 49 years later, and now we said, please, Lord, you know, come. And who would have thought it took, you know, we're in the 72nd year of Israel's being a nation, and but things just keep getting more and more moving in that direction, and the fact that, see, Israel is what changes it all. The fact that, you know, so well, people have always looked at prophecy being fulfilled in their lifetime. That's true, but it's not till modern times that Israel's back in the land, which brings all this other stuff into focus.
You know, I appreciate you being here, Tommy, and we'll wrap it up here, but to say, you know, keep looking, keep watching, keep reading, and again, our goal here is to bring you really good, solid, biblical, historically accurate information, getting rid of some of the rumors. You know, we're not basing our belief in a pre-trib rapture or even premillennial just on what we want. We're not here to escape troubling times. We're going to get out of here. We have a lot of respect and we have a lot of love for our brothers and sisters around the world who are currently suffering.
That's right.
And it doesn't mean that Americans won't have our turn if we say that God doesn't have a special, you know, favor towards us. He loves all of his children. But what we are doing is we're watching really the times change. We're watching things continue to accelerate. That's why we're here. We want to bring truth, and ultimately we want to bring the gospel that as we look at Scripture, truly, Jesus is the only way of salvation. If you haven't put your trust and faith in him, this is the time to do it. Things are heating up. Nobody can deny it. It's an exciting time to be a Christian. It's an exciting time to be a prophecy watcher, and it really is cool. And so, again, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching today. We continue to encourage you to look at what we're putting online, go find our magazine, find some other resources. As Jesus said, be watching and be ready because his return is soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.